The legacy of Sega is often etched into history without our notice, whether it be references in popular media or just cultural significance in general. Sega's history seems more important than you'd think to popular culture, and oddly more positively remembered now than you would think after researching their history. Once one of the largest corporations in the world, in the mid to late 90s they would face financial troubles after saturating the market with hardware and software that simply wasn't worth it. This is the story of Sega's last hurrah, the Dreamcast, and how it changed video games and the world of technologic entertainment forever. You can tell I do video essays based on the VCR. Most people would tell you, and in some ways rightfully so, that the Mega Drive, or Genesis if you're in the United States, is Sega's crowning achievement, the thing we should really remember them for. And again, in some ways they aren't totally wrong, but they leave out many parts of their history, and one in particular. But before we get to any of that, we have to focus on their golden years with the aforementioned Genesis, and what led up to its creation. Sega's presence in the video game market before the Genesis is seldom spoken of, even in the Sega fandom, outside of a few arcade games and one system in particular, the Sega Master System. Oftentimes those two things end up being the highlight of the 1980s for Sega, despite their earlier efforts such as the SG-1000 in 1983. Their arcade games such as the in-house developed Space Harrier, Fantasy Zone, Shinobi, and Afterburner were all well received, and now are often considered arcade classics. Sega oftentimes would as well publish games for other companies, most notably Frogger and Zaxxon. Their home console, however, wouldn't make it beyond Japan, despite outselling most of its competition, aside from Nintendo's Famicom. In 1985, Sega would release their first system to venture across the sea. In Japan, it was titled the Mark III, initially marketed overseas as the Sega Video Game System, or Sega System, and sometimes referred to as the Power Base, but most known as the Master System. The Master System is powered by an NEC 780C processor, the same as the SG-1000s, but features a different graphics chip. According to designer Hideki Sato, the Texas Instruments TMS-9918 was simply too weak for the company's needs. Instead, Sega would design their own graphics processor in-house, based off their System 2 arcade boards. The Master System was, unfortunately, in many ways, a failure in the United States, as well as Japan. However, sold much better in places such as Europe and Brazil, the latter of which were their still selling consoles today. Nearly 40 years later, Brazil is still playing the Master System. However, despite a re-release in 1987 in Japan under the overseas name of Master System, the system was still a failure. Allegedly, Sega only held 10% market share over Nintendo in their home country, as well as the United States. Amidst financial troubles, the Mark III and Master System consoles were dropped in favor of developing a new system. Sega of America sold distribution rights to the Master System to Tonka, yes, that Tonka, and Sega of Japan went back to the drawing board. In 1988, this would culminate in the Mega Drive, but if you live in the States, you probably know it as the Genesis.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't. So what's blast processing do?
It's very hard for me to state in hindsight how revolutionary the Genesis was for video games as a whole. Not only was it influential culturally, but also in its technical specifications. It was the first video game console with a fully 16-bit architecture, its processor being the Motorola 68000, clocked at nearly double the Master System CPU, and the first 16-bit CPU used in a video game system, at least from what I can tell. The 16-bit VDP, or graphics processor, is Sega's 315-5313 VDP based off the Yamaha YM7101. Unfortunately, one of Sega's greatest mistakes was the very release of the Sega Mega Drive in Japan. You see, it was supposed to release in late October 1988 on the 29th. Guess what else released in Japan in late October in 1988? Super Mario Bros. 3, the third in Nintendo's massive Mario franchise, which, okay, you know what, I don't even need to explain the impact of Mario 3, you already know, everyone watching this video knows. In Japan, Nintendo released Mario 3 less than a week before Sega were to release the Mega Drive. Now you'd think Sega would see this and understand that Nintendo, their greatest and at the time undefeated competition, would maybe pose a threat to their system and maybe they should just wait a few days. Nope, they released it on the 29th anyway. The Mega Drive in Japan fared poorly against NEC's PC Engine, also known as the TurboGrafx 16, the NES, and eventually the Super NES as well. Poor promotion, poor sales, and it's no shock as to why Sega were disappointed with the performance of their system in their home country. However, in August 1989, Sega would release the Mega Drive in North America as the Genesis. Similar to how it did in Japan, it initially sold slowly. Initial releases like Alex Kidd in the Enchanted Castle and ports of arcade blockbusters like Altered Beast simply weren't enough to keep the Genesis afloat. At one point, early in the Genesis lifespan, Sega programmer Yuji Naka presented a tech demo of a rolling ball in a 2D space, based on a concept by game designer Naoto Oshima. Shortly afterwards, Sega of Japan held an in-house contest to create a character as the protagonist of the game, and Oshima's design was a blue hedgehog named Sonic. This game concept would become the legendary Sonic the Hedgehog. In 1991, Sega of America president Tom Kalinske made the, at the time among Sega, incredibly controversial choice to bundle the game in with Genesis consoles in the United States, and slash the price of the Genesis down from $200 to only $150. The idea was to essentially give away Sonic the Hedgehog, as well as essentially giving the consumer an extra $50 to buy games with. The concept was simple, and the execution was flawless. Sega instantly became a household name, and even ended up surpassing Nintendo market share. Sonic the Hedgehog is about as simple as a game can get. Press right, press A, press down sometimes. And its simplicity is sort of what made it so accessible to gamers in the 90s. Say what you will about games being more complex now, but complexity and difficulty doesn't always equal quality or especially accessibility. Nintendo's offerings at the time, such as the aforementioned Mario 3, Legend of Zelda, and other developers' games such as Contra, weren't exactly the easiest thing, kind of famously. Video games were so expensive that developers felt that they needed to make sure the consumers felt like they were getting their money's worth. However, the cut-through difficulty of certain games was actually a turn-off, especially for younger players, leading to games being less accessible overall, and typically locked to a certain age grouping. Sitting there for hours cutting your teeth on Mario or Zelda wasn't always fun. Sonic the Hedgehog offered a simple challenge for all types of players. However, the easiest thing to point to for its success was the attitude.
Yeah, Sonic has an attitude. He races around at his speed, not at anyone else's speed.
Nintendo was positioned by Sega as the boring choice. Like a friend your parents always wished you'd be more like. Sega showcased themselves as having a rough, dangerous edge, which, although it seems ridiculous in hindsight considering they were marketing a game starring a blue hedgehog, it worked. By 1992, Sega were practically gods in the video game space, and the hits kept coming. Sonic the Hedgehog 2, 3, and Knuckles, Streets of Rage, Phantasy Star, Comic Zone, Earthworm Jim, Vector Man, Rystar, the list goes on. In 1992, Sega would release an add-on for the Genesis known as the Sega CD. As you can most likely gather from the name, this added CD capabilities to the Sega Genesis, leading to larger, more expansive games, such as Sonic CD in 1983, and, the other ones too. Yeah, that's something you'll see a lot of with the Sega CD. Not many games. I mean, sure, there's plenty of games on the Sega CD, but most were just ports of Genesis games with Red Book soundtracks, lazily slapped on with little to no new amenities. There was one game, however, that most of you may remember for all the wrong reasons. Night Trap is a full-motion video game released for the Sega CD in 1992. It's a campy 90s B-movie in the shape of a video game, with fully live-action scenes shot in Culver City, California. It was a fairly high-profile project at the time. The director of photography was Don Burgess, who went on to be the director of photography on Forrest Gump. The director, James Riley, went on to work on CSI Miami, The Office, 24, Shameless, and numerous others, according to IMDb, and the entire game even had a congressional hearing dedicated to it. Wait, what? On December 29th, 1993, a congressional hearing was held on violence in video games. Two examples were used, Sega's Night Trap being one, supposedly for violence against women, which is not glorified or controlled by the player in any way, shape, or form, and Midway's Mortal Kombat being another, citing violence in general. Despite Mortal Kombat being on the Genesis as well as the Super Nintendo, the Genesis featured a well-known, even at the time, cheat code, which would enable the full blood and gore of the arcade version, which was not advertised or disclosed to consumers who bought the game. During these hearings, Nintendo President Howard Lincoln made the hilarious claim that Night Trap would never appear on a Nintendo console, supposedly for it not holding up to their guidelines.
And let me say that for the record, I want to state that Night Trap will never appear on a Nintendo system.
The actual reason was Nintendo's hardware wouldn't be able to run Night Trap. Nintendo used this as a strategy to avoid the scandal and paint Sega as a terrible influence on children. In 1994, however, sales kept going amidst the controversy, with Sonic 3 being a blockbuster hit, and Sonic & Knuckles closely following. During this year, Sega of Japan approached Sega of America about the lifespan of the Genesis. Sega of America President Tom Kalinske thought that they could easily get another year out of the system in the United States. However, Sega of Japan were, a little bit less impressed with the sales of the system, and thought that they should put out a 32-bit system that year, which they did, and we'll get to that later. The aforementioned poor sales of the Genesis in Japan led to a need for a new console. However, the Genesis was doing just fine in North America, so Sega thought of a new approach. The Sega 32X is probably the biggest mistake Sega has ever made. No, I mean it, this thing is a piece of garbage. And I'm probably not the first one to say something like that in a video you've watched about Sega. The 32X was another add-on for the Genesis, which turned the formerly 16-bit console into a 32-bit one, doubling the hardware capabilities. I mean, it sounds excellent, right? On paper, it sounds like a dream. Imagine having a little flash drive that you could plug into your PS5 that doubles the power and gives you a whole new library of games to utilize this power. It sounds great, right? Wrong! You see, when I was talking about Sega of Japan wanting to release a new system earlier, they did. In 1994, Sega of Japan released the Saturn, their all-new 32-bit system, and practically forgot about the Mega Drive. Sega of America pretty much released the 32X as something to tide people over until the release of the Saturn in the United States. However, the 32X was not well received by consumers, who saw no point in the add-on. It has a measly library of 40 games in total, and even worse, Sega had the audacity to charge $160 for it, $10 more than the system retailed for, only to discontinue it in the early months of 1996, barely a year after its release. And in 1995, at the first E3, Sega's presentation focused on the Saturn, seeing it was to launch in the United States in the holiday season. Just kidding, we're launching it today. In May 1995, Sega surprise launched the Sega Saturn, with no warning to consumers, no prior promotion in the US, and an incredibly unprepared launch lineup at $399 US. Sony also presented at this event and spoke about their new PlayStation console, and after a brief introduction, SCEA President Steve Race walked up onto the stage and uttered one phrase.
I'm going to ask Sony Computer Entertainment President of America, Steve Race, to join me for a brief presentation. $299.
That right there is considered the exact moment Sega turned from the popular kid to a complete joke. With the overpriced Saturn, the underselling 32X and Game Gear, and the practically deserted Sega CD, Sega were oversaturating the market and frankly were in too deep. The Saturn, at least stateside, was a total flop. It bombed like very little else bombed, although it performed significantly better in Japan. The Saturn was hardly considered competition in the United States, and the battle ended up being mostly between Sony with their PlayStation and Nintendo with the Nintendo 64. And even still, the 64 was washed by Sony. Sony were unstoppable, and Sega's system didn't even have a Sonic game to call its own. They had Sonic Jam, a collection of Genesis games, Sonic R, a poorly received spin-off racing game, and Sonic 3D Blast, a port of an already released Genesis game. So, what's the deal with that? Well, Sonic Team had a Sonic game in development for the Saturn titled Sonic Extreme. Beginning development in 1994, Extreme faced development hell. Rotating engines, licensing issues on said engines, communication errors between Sega of America and Sega of Japan, eventually culminating in the announcement of the cancellation of the game in 1997. The Saturn was a laughingstock in the game community, and consumers were losing faith and trust in Sega as a corporation. Games like Virtua Fighter, Knights, Panzer Dragoon, and Bug were great, but couldn't hold attention to distract from the Sony PlayStation and Nintendo 64. Sega President Tom Kalinske stepped down from the company in 1996. Amidst financial troubles, Sega went back to the drawing board and began development on a project codenamed Dural. This would eventually become the Sega Dreamcast. The Dreamcast development was difficult, to say the least. Before the Dreamcast came out, Sega would consider, and even develop, with a few other companies, a Saturn II console. Other companies involved included Hitachi and Lockheed Martin, but this idea was eventually scrapped sometime in '96. Apparently as well, Sega went to NVIDIA to work on a GPU for their prototypes in 1996, and it nearly bankrupted them, leading Sega to invest $5 million into the company. Fun fact, this is the only reason NVIDIA still exists today. Even in the end, Sega would still not use NVIDIA's chipset. During this time period, they also seem to have worked on a console with 3DFX, makers of the Voodoo series of graphics processors for Windows computers. The graphics processor and the so-called Black Belt system were based off the Voodoo 2 and Voodoo Banshee chipsets, but allegedly never made it past prototype stages. In 1997, Sega showed a demo of the system to a few software developers, such as Core Design, creators of the Tomb Raider series, but the project was scrapped. At some point even, there was talk about the system being water-cooled instead of traditional heat sinks like most other systems on the market at the time, which is a bizarre concept for a console even nowadays, and would have simply been too expensive to produce. In 1997 at E3, the new president of Sega of America made the great claim that the Saturn was not their future, which led to even more of a rush from Sega of Japan and Sega of America to develop a new system. In early 1998, the Doral project was renamed to Katana. This is the beginning of where we see the final evolutions of the project, seen in this photo from Sega Retro, although this version is missing logos as well as having a circular start button, unlike the final console's design. Microsoft also licensed their Windows CE operating system out to Sega for games, though it didn't get much use officially outside of game development. In November 1998, Sega released the Dreamcast in Japan. That same year, the Saturn was discontinued worldwide, so Sega would go a full year without a console in the United States from 1998 to 99. Leading up to the launch, Sega began promoting the system with Dreamcast magazine. These, similar to PlayStation Underground, came with demo discs as well as news about the upcoming system.
Sega is flexing its newfound muscles with its brand new game system called Dreamcast.
This is the first time I ever played it.
First time for Matt Mignogno, because this is the first day it went on sale.
We believe the future of gaming is the internet.
One of the sector's big players is Sega Dreamcast. Mike shows us how it is hoping to blunt the heavily promoted launch this fall of Sony's PlayStation 2.
Sales that are expected to bring in $45 million, and that's just today.
Our retail receipts for consoles and software will be bigger than the movie receipts at the box office.
For the first time, a video game system will allow you to play your opponent, who doesn't even have to be in the same room, in the same city, or the same state. You'll be able to play online.
On September 9th, 1999, Sega released the Dreamcast in North America, and October 14th, 1999 in Europe. The launch lineup in America was packed with quality titles, including but not limited to Sonic Adventure, Power Stone, Soul Calibur, Blue Stinger, Ready to Rumble, Hydro Thunder, and Mortal Kombat Gold. Several quintessential titles to the system's legacy. And soon, the Dreamcast became their fastest-selling system at launch.
Total dollar figure!
Let's take a look at the hardware. On the system itself, we see the traditional power and open button, although no reset button. This was Sega's first mainline home console since the SG-1000 not to have one. So the decision is a little odd, but it also makes sense. The system uses discs, same as the Saturn, although it uses a special media called GD-ROMs, standing for Gigabyte Disc. These discs could hold a gigabyte of data instead of 700 megabytes like most CD-ROMs could at that point. This was one of Sega's methods of copy protecting the Dreamcast, though within a full year of its launch, its copy protection was cracked, leading to piracy becoming rampant on the system and part of the reason for the system's demise. On the back of the system, we have the Figure 8 power input, a video output, and a port just labeled Serial. This barely ended up being used for anything aside from the Neo Geo Pocket Color link cable and a console link cable, with which you could link two Dreamcasts together and play multiplayer on them. This wasn't widely utilized. And on our left, we see the 56K modem. This is probably the most notable feature on the Dreamcast and one of its most innovative. The Dreamcast was the first console ever to support online gaming out of the box. This became a significant selling point for the system, and it helped to popularize online gaming, and in many ways was the ace up Sega's sleeve in the console wars. Games like Quake 3 Arena, Choo Choo Rocket, and Phantasy Star Online could all be played with others over the internet, all the way back in 1999. Sonic Adventure even had DLC, the first console game to do so, on its website even as early as launch day. I covered this more in my Sonic Adventure website retrospective if you're interested. On the controller side of things, we have one analog stick, 4 buttons as opposed to the Saturn's 6-button design, a start button, a directional pad, and 2 triggers. This was the first major console to use analog triggers, and as well the second controller to ever use Hall effect sensors instead of potentiometers for the analog stick, the first also being by Sega for the Saturn, effectively fixing the issue of controller drift before it was even a common issue. The console also features 4 controller ports for maximum multiplayer. Sega's memory card for the system was titled the VMU, or Visual Memory Unit. One of the only memory cards to ever have a screen. When inserted to the controller, these could display information to the player such as health or lives, but most of the time just showed a cute logo while playing the game. So of course you may be asking, what are the games like on the game console? And I'm glad you asked. The Dreamcast had one of the best game libraries out of any game system in its era, even ones that outlasted it by several years. I've picked 10 games to go over here. Possibly the most 1999 game ever, Crazy Taxi is one of the most addictive and fun arcade games of all time, and the Dreamcast board is no slouch. With the Naomi arcade hardware that Crazy Taxi uses being based on the same Katana project that the Dreamcast architecture is, essentially making it a slightly beefed up Dreamcast, the Dreamcast board is near identical to the arcade version and features an original mode with a different map, as well as the original arcade map and mode. Most of Crazy Taxi is spent being the PG-rated version of Grand Theft Auto, driving around running into cars attempting to run into people, and failing, but the main goal of the game is just driving a taxi. The arcade physics, the wild pop-punk soundtrack by The Offspring and Bad Religion, the style of the game, the real-life locations in the game, all make for Crazy Taxi being one of the best games on the system. It's also one of the cheapest too, typically showing up for $20 or less at used game stores. It's also available on other platforms, though Sega delisted it from Steam recently along with many other Dreamcast games for unknown reasons. Highly recommend picking this one up. There's also a sequel, the aptly titled Crazy Taxi 2, though this one isn't as well remembered as the first, and I've never played it, so I can't offer much insight into it. Jet Set Radio, known as Jet Grind Radio if you're in the US, is in many ways the quintessential Dreamcast game. You play as Beat, or any of the other characters associated with the protagonist group GG's, and roller skate around cityscapes while doing graffiti, and running from the police if you get caught doing said graffiti. It's a very fun arcade-style experience that, despite being a little simplistic, is still entertaining hours into the game. The best part of the game, though, in many ways, is the soundtrack, done by the great Hideki Naganuma. Reminiscent of big beat artists from the late 90s, such as Fatboy Slim, The Chemical Brothers, and The Prodigy, it fits the game perfectly and is oftentimes the best remembered part of it. Obviously the game is great too, but I don't think I would revisit it so often if it weren't for the OST. Jet Set Radio is a classic, although it's sort of inaccessible. Like Crazy Taxi, Sega delisted this one from Steam as well, but unlike Crazy Taxi, this one isn't too cheap on the original system, with complete US copies going for upwards of $80. Honestly, your best bet is to legally obtain a copy from a legal website with legally sourced copies of the game, with an emulator that is definitely legal, but you didn't hear from it.
Most disturbing.
Sonic Adventure is my favorite game of all time. Can you tell? The first truly 3D entry in the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise often is one of its more controversial, mainly due to its port to the Nintendo GameCube in 2003 being riddled with bugs, and of course being the one that's most readily available. Thanks, Sega. Very cool. Despite this, I love the Dreamcast version of this game. The sense of adventure in this game is unrivaled to me. The responsive controls, the fun level design, the soundtrack, it's all here. Despite the Big the Cat part of the game being poorly designed and poorly received even back then, and especially nowadays, you don't have to play through that section of the game unless you're trying to 100% it, which most people are not. This was one of the launch titles for the system that I mentioned earlier, and in many ways the Dreamcast Mario 64. A robust, innovative, responsive 3D platformer that in many ways still holds up today. Plenty of critics will tell you that it's aged poorly or wonky, but I encourage you, the viewer, to pick up a copy of the DX version of the game on Steam and install the Dreamcast conversion set of mods that essentially make this version into a widescreen 60fps version of the Dreamcast title. Unlike the other Dreamcast Collection titles, this one is still on Steam for a relatively cheap price. I got it on sale for less than $1 at one point. I'd even say it's worth the $8 you'd pay even when it's not on sale. Or you can grab a Dreamcast copy for far too much money like I did. A true classic. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, Quake 3 Arena, also known as probably the only time I'll ever get to talk about Quake on this channel for more than a second, is an all-time classic. A 1999 arena shooter developed by ID Software, or id Software, creators of Doom and Wolfenstein. It may not have started the genre, but it sure perfected it. The third in the Quake series and the second to get a Sega console port after Quake on the Saturn, this one is near identical to the PC version and also adds some new maps. The one disadvantage of the Dreamcast version of the game, obviously, is the fact that the controller only has one analog stick, but Sega actually released a keyboard and mouse bundle for the Dreamcast that are supported by Quake 3, essentially making it into the PC version with local multiplayer. The control setups widely vary too, letting you configure with keyboard and controller, keyboard and mouse, just controller, or keyboard and mouse. This is one of the most fun to play in multiplayer and even still works today. The online functions are even cross-compatible, something virtually unheard of for online gaming in 2000. Obviously, you'd probably have a better experience playing on a PC with the IO Quake 3 source port with everything maxed out, but honestly this is a solid version of the game for couch co-op, and I highly recommend it. On the opposite side of online gaming, Choo Choo Rocket is one of the most insane and frenetic games I have ever played. You and 3 other players, whether they be computer players or people in real life, are tasked with placing down arrows to direct mice into your own stations while also avoiding cats, who eat said mice, and if they make it into your station, you lose a significant chunk of your points. The player with the most mice wins, however, every, 15 seconds, a randomized event happens. Whether it's Mouse Mania, a flood of mice, or Cat Mania, the same thing but with cats, or slowing down the movement of the game or speeding it up, the game is pure chaos. Unfortunately, this one also isn't the most readily available, though the Dreamcast version isn't too expensive from what I've seen. My copy was $25 at the local used game store I go to, but I've seen it for even less. I don't really have much more to say about it, it's just a classic great game. Daytona USA 2001, a sequel to the arcade title and Sega Saturn game, Daytona USA, is a quite enjoyable arcade racer, somewhat like Ridge Racer in Sega's own Sega Rally series. Just a good classic title with fun driving physics, though quite expensive on the used games market. Again, a legally obtained copy of the game is probably your best bet. Virtua Tennis is just that, a tennis game. In some ways nothing more than that, though it's a very fun arcadey experience. Kind of in the same way as Daytona, I don't really have a lot to say about it other than it's just very good. But unlike Daytona, this one is dirt cheap. I paid less than $10 for my copy at a half-price books. It's quite enjoyable with friends, and I recommend picking it up if you're getting into the Dreamcast. Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2 is unironically one of the greatest games ever made. Developed by Neversoft and released in 2000, it didn't start the genre of skateboarding games, but it was most definitely what perfected it. Most remember either the PlayStation or Nintendo 64 versions of the game, but this Dreamcast port is undeniably the best. An excellent soundtrack, simple but effective gameplay, and a fun campaign makes this a relaxing game to just kinda zone out to. Even when I sat down to play this game for this portion of the video, I realized an hour had gone by of me just playing the Freescape mode, and I hadn't even noticed. This is another pretty inexpensive one, my copy was only about $15, and it's absolutely worth your time. Or you can play the excellent remaster on Steam, PS4, Xbox One, or Switch if you so please. Sonic Adventure 2 is the sequel to my favorite game of all time. In many ways I'd consider it not quite as good as Adventure 1, but I still very much appreciate it for what it is, and in many ways this was my favorite for many years. Despite its many design flaws, it's a very worthy sequel to Adventure 1, and the linear gameplay is actually significantly easier to get into for most. The one rough part of the game is the Knuckles and Rouge treasure hunting levels, but with walkthroughs they aren't too hard to suffer through. Most of them. The Sonic, Shadow, Tails, and Eggman levels are most definitely the highlights of the experience. The game is in many ways an all-time classic, and even if I like Adventure 1 more now, I appreciate Adventure 2 just as much. Dreamcast copies of Adventure 2 are notoriously expensive nowadays, with copies fetching upwards of $150 complete on sites like eBay, but the Steam version of the game works flawlessly with no mods needed, as well as adding in the Sonic Adventure 2 Battle Editions in the GameCube port of the game. I highly recommend Sonic Adventure 2. Shenmue is one of the greatest games ever to grace the earth. No, I mean it. The amount of realism, the quality of the storytelling, the artwork, the design, the detailing, it's all amazing. It's still one of the most immersive games I've ever played, even with the overly literal translation and sometimes monotonous gameplay. The game spreads across 3 discs, and even with walkthroughs and online guides, is still quite a long journey. You play as Ryo, the son of a martial arts master who runs a dojo, and is killed early on in the game by a mysterious street gang. You search through numerous small Japanese cities, trying to avenge the death of your father. You walk around and speak to locals, trying to gather evidence and playing detective. It's quite fun, and it honestly deserves its own video. It's very easy to get sucked into the storyline and feel like you're truly there. Though, reportedly, it cost Sega $70 million and almost bankrupted them. Sega essentially lost money on every copy of Shenmue sold, but they put all that aside and purely focused on innovation, which nearly killed them. And segueing past the list of games, this ended up being a massive problem for Sega in the end. They simply spent too much money on the Dreamcast, and in the latter half of 2000, Dreamcast sales plummeted. Sega's fate was very uncertain around this time. They even became so desperate as to sell Dreamcasts that they would give away free Dreamcasts if you signed up for the online service. That is insane to think about. Imagine if Microsoft would give away free Xbox Series X systems to people who signed up for Xbox Live Gold memberships. It just wouldn't happen if the company wasn't in financial trouble. The writing was on the wall. No matter how successful the Dreamcast was, Sega wasn't able to support it. Amidst piracy, and with the launch of the PlayStation 2 later that year, the Dreamcast was never going to make it. Consumers lost interest, and Sega lost money. On January 31st, 2000, Sega would announce that it would be pulling the Dreamcast from international markets on March 31st of that year. The Dreamcast was done only a little over 2 years after its launch in Japan, 16 months after its launch in the US, and only 15 months after its launch in Europe. Sega's home console hardware business followed suit, as they announced they wouldn't be continuing to make consoles, and would only exist as a third-party software developer. Their influence would live on with the Microsoft Xbox, which actually borrowed its controller scheme and very concept from the Dreamcast. That classic ABXY scheme you Xbox fans love so much? That was the Dreamcast. The built-in network capabilities? That was the Dreamcast. Dreamcast support ended as planned on March 31st, and its final major release, Sonic Adventure 2, was released in June of 2001. The legacy of the Dreamcast lives on in its fans, with websites like Sega Retro, Dreamcast Talk, Dreamcast Live, etc. People are still releasing games to it, even now, and porting games as well. There's a port of Grand Theft Auto 3 that's been in process for a few months now, and is even in a playable alpha state. Postal 1 even got a Dreamcast port recently that was available for sale. Valve's 1998 shooter Half-Life had a port that was basically finished, but didn't get a release due to the console being discontinued and sales dropping off. It has been bootlegged online and is quite easy to access. Half-Life Blue Shift was even planned for this version. Doom and the original Quake also have unofficial ports that are pretty easy to come by. Despite the legacy of the Dreamcast being cut short in many ways, the volume of quality titles released during its lifetime rivals many systems of its era and even possibly beats the libraries of consoles that were around for double, even triple the amount of time. And as is with many Sega releases, the fans have kept it alive through mods, new releases, and new support over 26 years since its launch in 1998. The Dreamcast never failed us. We failed the Dreamcast. And I encourage you all to take a look into the Dreamcast beyond just this video. Plenty of other creators have made more in-depth buying guides on the system, and there's plenty more I didn't go over here for the sake of not boring the less attentive viewers. The Dreamcast spirit lives on through developers and fans, and is still a viable platform today for many developers. You can even still browse many old internet sites via the Dreamcast web browser if you so please. Many websites have been created with the Dreamcast in mind. As I write this, it's late January, and 24 years after the Dreamcast's discontinuation, it's still thinking, and it wouldn't be without you all. Thank you for watching this video and learning about the legacy and impact of the system. Consider checking out my other videos on Sonic Adventure 1 and 2, and my future videos. You all made this channel happen, and in many ways I wouldn't be doing this if it weren't for the Dreamcast. My very first video was a retrospective on the Dreamcast, much like this one, though much less researched, and I created the channel for the purpose of talking about this system, and the games that got me invested in it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all next time.
This is the day you have trained for, the day you have studied for. Utilize your superior skills, your superior intelligence.
Sit down, rodent.
Sarah, baby!
Oh, you were one.
Don't make me hurt you. Learn to defeat your ruthless enemy, Steve of Hackensack.
Brian, you're gonna get roofed.
Shut up, quadruped.